Hi, welcome to Our Time is a Garden, which is a series of nature writing workshops in partnership with the Scottish BPOC Writers Network and IASH at the University of Edinburgh. Workshop 1 was facilitated by Vahni, Anthony, Ezekiel, Capildeo, and their talk was titled Present, Not Pristine, on Colonialism's Erasures. Vahni, Anthony, Ezekiel, Capildeo, who is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, is a Trinidadian Scottish writer of poetry and nonfiction. Capildeo's 8 books and 9 pamphlets include Like a Tree Walking and Gentle Housework of the Sacrifice. Their interests include plurilingualism, silence, traditional masquerade, and multidisciplinary collaboration. They are writer-in-residence and professor at the University of York, a visiting scholar at Pembroke College, Cambridge, an honorary student of Christ Church, Oxford, and a lay Dominican inquirer.
Of a laundry rack together with second-hand cushions. But I think this is very true of the sort of environments in which we find our minds creating gardens of words, that they don't necessarily correspond, or they correspond in odd ways to the environments we find ourselves building with found materials as 21st century willing and unwilling migrants. Now, I do apologize if my eyes seem to be going in odd directions, but as I was saying just before the workshop began to the organizers, my printer is not working, so I'm going to be looking at a different screen. Okay, so Present, Not Pristine is the title that came to me when I wanted to give this talk, partly in reaction, and I do want to get away from the sense of writing as a reaction, or writing against, or writing to or with, but partly in reaction against the unconsciously ethno-fascist creation, nostalgically, of perfect landscapes. So the perfect landscape is very closely allied to the landscape where there is nothing. And this is going to be offensive, but one of the bad sort of non-joke jokes about the name of Canada, for example, is Canada, that nothing is here. And that way of looking at a landscape and deciding to read it as nothing is typical of the colonial gaze, because if you read a place as nothing, you can not only obliterate history, but you can free yourself, not just free yourself from engaging with whoever was there and whoever is there, but even make it heroic that you have refused to do so. So there's a lot of spin and gaslighting in the word nothing. And what I'd like you to reflect on, and this is one of the things we might do in the writing workshop if you want to take that direction, is the difference between the related words vast and waste. So T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland, for example, feels free to appropriate everything, including Sanskrit, which many scholars writing on the poem are completely incapable of dealing with, or indeed acknowledging the way that non-Western philosophy and poetry was being received in the late 19th, early 20th century in Europe and the Americas. But T.S. Eliot feels free to take the post-war landscape of the place of the skull, things that are broken, the garden of the dead, and call it the wasteland, because the wasteland suggests that previously there was a garden, there was a paradise, there was Eden in the fall. Consider the difference if that poem had been called The Vast. The vast would have that sort of Columbus feeling that you are setting out upon the uncharted deep, and then anything you name is also something you create. You become the magician, Prospero. So there's that dynamic between the vast versus the waste, and I would quite like us to be sensitive to that also in modern writing. Now, I would also like to be particularly controversial and political, which is one of the things I do, as I only have a floating attachment to most institutions, and it's a peculiar sort of freedom. And I would like to call the attention to what places have been bombed in the last 30 or 40 years. The places that have been bombed, such as Baghdad, Aleppo, Kabul, are the great places of ancient civilization, the places with libraries and jewels and architecture. And to return those places to sand and stone is literally to obliterate the call to engage with our long history and our shared history, because those were also places of incredible mixing. And if you don't want to read the historical mixing, you also don't have to learn the languages. So I'll talk both of the literal bombing, I'll just name it here, but also I'll talk now of the destruction of our universities, and the capitalist destruction of our universities, but also the distrust of expertise, and the dumbing down of the public, so people prefer postcards or cage fights, the discovery or the individual romantic item version of history, rather than the complicated history, whereby you have to look at how silver has traveled, or how many people, why it is that there are so-called Viking ruins in Istanbul, what exactly was happening, who was talking to whom. There wasn't a point when people weren't talking to each other. The only thing is that we can refuse to reckon with that as poets and writers, or we can decide to reckon with it. Reckoning with it doesn't mean becoming an academic historian necessarily. It can also just mean being sensitive to the layering of the voices in any one instant. Okay, so I'd like to stop that sort of weird preamble now and make 4 points, 4 sub-points to my first main point, which is the sense of inhabitation versus the romanticization of loss, and the built versus the natural. And the first of those 4 points has to do with invisible thresholds. And I would like you to reflect on how, under the pandemic, invisible thresholds have or haven't been felt by you in your personal life, and also have and haven't been noticed in your experience of policy making in your institutions or the media that you read or consume. What I mean by invisible thresholds is, for example, can the public parks were closed off in Trinidad where I had my first lockdown, but can the public park be a place of safety? If, for example, you're escaping domestic violence, you want to escape domestic violence, then the public park can be where you make that phone call or meet that key worker. And the threshold that you cross from the dangerous home to the safe park is the opposite to what you often get in media narratives around persons gendered female and safety. Another invisible threshold in COVID would be, for example, the linguistic threshold. So what language or languages are spoken in your workplace versus or where you go to buy your work lunch if you're employed, versus what language or languages are spoken in your home or the building you happen to live. And that'll have been another kind of quite dizzying shift for some people, whereas with other people that have been a continuity. That's another invisible threshold. And this is why in the prep materials for this talk, I had included the wonderful conversation that Diane Brand had with me as we were walking along Bloor Street in Toronto. And some of the invisible thresholds along those streets were the linguistic thresholds, as without conflict, you just shade naturally from one community into the next. And you might hear Greek, you might hear Spanish. As you walk along, you might hear Chinese. And it's just this sort of shading of where people have begun to congregate. And there isn't really a visible threshold unless you're super sensitive to things like the signage of shops or the content of shops. Or there mightn't even be that marker. Okay, so this is subpoint number 1. I'll just very briefly talk again about invisible thresholds not related to COVID, but to colonialism and erasures. But this is kind of related to COVID as well. So activists from the Orisha community in Trinidad, such as the writer Attila Springer, Orisha, of course, being a West African-derived polytheism, made the point that as for the Hindu community in Trinidad, the rivers, the riverbanks, certain forest groves, or the edge of the sea are actually necessary places for the rituals that shape and give meaning to everyday life and where people meet. So not being, because the beaches have been closed off in Trinidad according to the COVID rates, to close off those places of trees and running water isn't just a question of policing leisure activity or luxury space. It's also a question of not understanding how ritual is inscribed in the natural environment and how a particular grove or river carries as much meaning as a statue or a cathedral. And I'll give a concrete example. Well, I would recommend to you the writings of Attila Springer, who also writes as Tilla, Tillah. But I'll also talk very briefly about the Forest Meeting House. There's a Forest Meeting House in Trinidad, which is now a meeting house of the Orisha, but it's also traditionally many hundreds of years ago, where indigenous people, who despite what is said in the history books still survived, gave shelter to the African enslaved people who followed the Orisha traditions and helped them survive the erasures of colonialism. And it's only now a built environment. And when I tried to get a taxi there to go to a ceremony to which I had been invited for cross-community purposes, I could find almost no taxi driver who would agree to go. And even nowadays. Okay, so point two. Point two is the peculiar echoes. I'm going to look at Jane Eyre very briefly in this point two under our sense of inhabitation versus romanticization of lost, built versus natural. And most of you will be familiar, I hope, with Mr. Rochester, the Byronic brooding hero or anti-hero in Charlotte Bronte's 19th century novel Jane Eyre, who unfortunately has his first wife, Bertha Rochester, the Creole who looks like a vampire, enclosed as a madwoman in his attic, while he woos the lovely, introverted, pale Jane Eyre, who's half his age or whatever, and a model of virtue. And I was thinking how this is very similar, in fact, to the portrait of Dorian Gray, that an easy reading of that situation would be that Bertha Rochester is a kind of quasi-racialized dark secret in the colonial master's house, literally. But another way is to see Bertha not as Jane's obverse, but to see her as Rochester's obverse. Because Mr. Rochester is seen as a consumer. He wants to buy fine dresses for Jane Eyre, and it's part of her apparent virtue that she refuses a sort of showy pink silk, which we aren't told, of course, in the novel would probably have been imported from somewhere like India or China, somewhere that has been erased in the novel as a colonial place with an extractive relation to Mr. Rochester's England. But Mr. Rochester consumes, for the presumably Eastern silks, he consumes women. He's, as well as having his Creole wife, he's had a French mistress. So, despite Mr. Rochester being seen as the consumer, Bertha Rochester, his wife, is depicted as resembling the foul German spectre called the vampire. And so I would suggest with the vampirism there's a kind of floating vampirism. So the vampire in the attic is showing us the truth of Mr. Rochester as colonial master, just like the uglified portrait in the attic is showing us the truth of the youthful-seeming Dorian Gray in Oscar Wilde's novella. But you have to be able to look across gender boundaries to identify Bertha and Mr. Rochester. Then the third point, which is just really more sort of memoristic thing in this sense of inhabitation versus romanticization of loss, this is a memoiristic anecdote from when I was researching the growing of cocoa in modern-day Trinidad. And Again, I was taking a taxi, but this was a shared taxi that only went twice a day and would stop anywhere along the route so that people flagged it down from the capital up a hill to a very remote area where there's still people of mixed indigenous descent carrying out traditional ways of cultivating cocoa. And because I wanted to learn things, the cab driver instantly started giving away to me how natural looking roots were actually cultivated roots. So what looked like just forest, it looked to my uneducated eye, or my colonially educated eye, it just looked like rainforest falling away from the precipice. He started showing me how to read it according to paths of fruit trees and other trees, and explaining that there were pathways you could safely walk in the forest that would take you from valley to valley, and they were hundreds, if not thousands of years old, and he would tell me what they were. And it made my heart break, because I suddenly felt like a Spaniard in the 15th century, and that all I would have to do is smile or give him a glass bead, and suddenly the island would be given away to me, not because he was stupid, but because there's an assumption that the desire for knowledge goes with the desire for participatory good faith. I don't think there's anything naive in that. I think that should be a form of community we aspire to. But in how many texts is that written up as naive? You show a kindness to the native and he shows you the way into the land. I think instead it should be written up as our corruption when we fail to understand that that's a really delicate and elaborate way of inflecting knowledge as community wisdom, and literally how you get around the land, while letting the land appear pristine. You can be present in it. And then the fourth kind of subpoint here is quite odd. And this is the bit which is going to sound not sane, but I don't particularly care, because as I say, I only have a floating relationship to institutions. It's the dream as a diagnostic tool. And I'm very interested in how speculative fiction, for example by Nalo Hopkinson, or the earlier ghost stories by people like Jean Rhys, speculative fiction or genre fiction, also by a writer like Wilson Harris, whose father, of course, was a surveyor who literally knew the land of Guyana inch by on foot. How Wilson Harris's experimental magical realist forms, for example, that these are the better ways of writing in anti-colonial fashion about the human in the landscape and the riches of the imagination and the intractability of the landscape, not as being in some kind of opposition, but in being in an ever more elaborate mutual relation. And here I would recommend the dream as diagnostic tool. That's the bit that sounds not quite sane. But I have had repeated dreams ever since I left Trinidad of returning violently to Port of Spain. And these dreams follow the conventions of the ghost stories, usually the colonial era ghost stories that I read eagerly in my late teens and early 20s. And in one such dream, I kept on being returned to a place I knew was Port of Spain, but I didn't recognize it because the rivers were running there in different places. And then I eventually realized, after speaking to some older people, that what my mind had done, what my brain had done, was process physical, geographical cues in the environment as to where the rivers had been diverted underground to make the present-day reservoirs. And my unconscious mind had picked up, again on patterns of trees and dampness and watercourses, it had reconstituted the Port of Spain of the 1700s, where rivers would have run as visible boundaries rather than being driven underground. It's just the fact that I had lived there in one place in my mother's house for the first 18 years of my life, and that house hasn't changed in the whole time it's been there. And because I had that ability to have continuity of place, that my brain was able to unpeel layers of place. But weirdly, I didn't do this through academic research or through the conscious wandering of the edge lands as a privileged psychogeographer who's convinced that he, and usually he, can uncover the secrets of the past, but rarely just by dwelling and being somehow physically sensitive to things like damp and green, that my mind processed through the ghost story, or perhaps through the narrative of reincarnation, what had rarely been done in terms of urban planning, and therefore what would have been encountered more by indigenous people or by early colonists. And I think the creative writing takeaway from that is to use the dream as tool, to take your dreams seriously, to keep a notebook, and don't feel too mad if you go looking in archives and old maps, or go on foot with your notebook through the landscape. You can also use your dreams as a guide, and also oral histories, talking to older people, including and especially those without formal education. I'm sorry, I've done two other events recently, and I don't have the vocal cord strength to keep talking because normally I live alone. The second point is, what ruins have you known, and how do you feel about them? And here my slightly provocative take is there can be a romanticization of ruins as either belonging to war. I think recollections of war are quite pernicious, especially as ethnofascism is rising or creeping in even to people who want to be sweet and soft and nostalgic about the land. Because if the ruins are related to war, people can either be performing heroic suffering or heroic being put upon. This is where my grandfather lived on half a potato, where his leg was shot off, but he was a pacifist, Sorry, that's a horrible kind of satirical thing to say. But what I was thinking is, if you look, for example, at the Old English, not Anglo-Saxon elegies, like the one which is commonly translated and edited under the title The Ruin, you'll see how the Old English invaders were living with what were actually the ruins of the Roman invaders, and sort of poking around them and wondering what they were, and vaguely thinking, well, maybe these were the giants from the Bible, and or maybe these were the people who knew about dragons and all that. So they were quite happily inventing a mythological past. There's something rather gentle and weird about that which I enjoy, because it's not violent. And I mean, it shows they've been colonized, obviously. They've been sort of Christianly colonized. That's why they're reaching to the Old Testament for an origin narrative. But they're also living among these stones. And in a way, I find refreshing that there isn't a possession of them. There's a dreaming with them. And that made me ask the question of writing of place, the same question I want to ask with love poems. So when you read a love poem, do you put yourself in the position of the lover or the beloved or the narrator? Do you own or do you serve? Or neither? Are you an eavesdropper? So similarly, if you look at ruins or you imagine ruins, what language do you speak? What language do you imagine being spoken among the ruins? And what do you imagine your life would have been at the era of those ruins? Would your life even have been there? Could it have been? And why I set a Gina Reese story about somebody who used to live there in what's obviously the ruins of a kind of estate or plantation house, is I realized that I'm imagining a white Creole ghost. I'm imagining the people who live there now might be mixed race, or not even mixed race. They might not even be white at all, in any way. And I imagine the person who lived there might have spoken French or Spanish or Portuguese or Dutch or Creole based on one of those, whereas the people living there now might be speaking English in the very proper way of someone who learned it in school, and then a dialect that's based more on Bhojpuri or Hindustani or Yoruba at base. And then the other thing I'm imagining is the ghost died young and therefore too young to leave, because I'm imagining a colonial trajectory for a young white girl who should go abroad to boarding school and marry a nice white doctor in England or Ireland or somewhere. And so too young to leave. So to live is to leave, and to die on sight is to be trapped, to haunt, to have the unexpected outcome. So do ruins belong to people who are mobile, to people who are expected to own them, to leave them and come back, or maybe not come back? Or are the ruins places in which you are trapped as a ghost? Whose ghost? Or are you forever a tourist in those ruins? And when you're reading the writing of place or the writing of ruins, and the writing implicitly or explicitly makes the claim, because I love it, what's the quality of that love? Is there the expectation that the narrator has ownership or has a voice? Or is there the expectation of exile or microaggression or being misunderstood? How are we present in a non-pristine way to that place that the writing loves? I personally have a particular fascination with ports, because the wrong people are always fetching up in ports, and sailors are always having relationships with the wrong people. And whenever you're in a port, you can take it for granted that if you did do DNA testing or folk song research, the results would be deeply upsetting to many. My last point, because I think we're heading up to 20 minutes now, is living traditions versus learning about living traditions, and then also the recognition of what's there, which is why I set a piece in the preparatory reading from Tracy Assing, the Indigenous photographer, filmmaker, and journalist in Trinidad, whose heritage I wasn't aware of for the first few years, and I knew her, and who very kindly did free sensitivity reading for me for my book Measures of Expatriation, which was published in 2016. And I hadn't realized that I was writing about her people as extinct, because I had been taught that at school, and also because she and others like her had grown up expecting that hiding was a form of living, and therefore not declaring themselves until you'd been friends for a decade or proven yourself in some way. So I'd like to interrogate who in a text is dead but present, or present but dead. Like, which traditions do you know are there, but they aren't there? Do you know that things aren't supposed to be around? And the second thing is literally what your expectations of a modern building. One, for example, how many should sleep in a room? Two, if, for example, you're living in a stone house, do you either know people who are quite poor and live rurally in stone houses, or have you been willing to learn from Tories who live in stone houses? Or are you taking it seriously when a new bourgeoisie wants a stone house that looks nice, but then effectively kill the stone by doing things like injecting damp courses or expecting every room to be hot all the time, rather than making one or two rooms livable in the winter and living in a nest in the winter and then expanding out? So are we as modern people willing to learn about a kind of systolic diastolic rhythm of living in vernacular architecture? Or is there a kind of capitalistic way of living in architecture? And do we ever look back at what we consider to be the texts we know about, like Dickens or the Brontes or Hardy? Do we ever look back and see how people are actually living in the built and natural environments in those practical ways? And can those be clues to our expectations as we do a new eco-imagination for how we might reclaim the housing we have now, or the environments we're going to be forced to live in with less and less oil, or ideally less and less oil? So that's living traditions versus learning about living traditions and recognition of what's there. And just to go back to what we might use in Skin Can Hold, I both write from a dream I had of a library in a bombed Middle Eastern country, and then write an explicit poem and couplets. In this book, I talk about loving places that you don't necessarily own. And in this book, which is really interesting to me, I use forms of nocturnes, lullabies, and walks to talk about the same walks in Port of Spain and Trinidad, and reading the deep landscape. What's interesting to me is that reviewers in the UK have tended to see the rail walks as very literary and imaginative, when I'm just describing the sort of deep dive into the creolized landscape. And the one that's purely imaginary, set in an imaginary France, is taken to be the real one. So that is my conclusion. And our three main points were sense of inhabitation versus romanticization of loss. What ruins have you known and how do you feel about them? And then living traditions versus learning about living traditions and recognition of what is there. And thank you so much. I nearly clicked leave, but I'm not going to.
Thank you so much, Vahni. You got a few rounds of applause in the chat from people, or in the videos from people who videos are on. That was incredible. For anybody in this room that maybe missed a few things as we were listening, this will be available for you to rewatch if you ever want to come back to it as well, which I know I will be. So thank you, Vahni. We'll take a break until about 10:50 and then reconvene for some of the writing workshop. So yeah, get a cup of tea and I'll see you in a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.